Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to BioStrategy Partners January 2023 first Practical Knowledge Series event. Today, we're going to be talking about innovation basics and the best practices of technology transfer. Hopefully, you can learn about the fundamentals of turning a scientific discovery and research into innovation. So my name is Brian Chow. I am the Program Director of BioStrategy Partners. We are a nonprofit consortium that strives to advance early stage technologies coming out of academia by providing administrative, educational, and investment support. So I'm happy to discuss our programs, which we have primarily three programs: the Germinator, the KIZ tax credit program, and what you're seeing here, the Practical Knowledge series. I would like to thank our sponsors, Armstrong Teasdale, who we have a representative today, Pat Kelly. Thank, we want to thank our sponsors, CBRE, MVM Associates, and Meniscus Limited. Okay, so before I hand it off to Pat, I just want to go through a couple housekeeping rules. Please mute your mics on joining, and please also, if you have any questions while we're talking, put your questions in the chat, and I will kind of pop up my video and ask the questions to the panelists. All right. With that, I would like to introduce Pat Kelly, a counsel at Armstrong Teasdale, and he has over 30 years of life science experience consulting on intellectual property in the industry. So, and I would like Pat Kelly introduce himself a little bit more. Pat, go ahead. Pat, I think you are free.
Yeah, hi. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm Pat Kelly. I'm a patent attorney of counsel at Armstrong Teasdale here in Philadelphia. I have with us today Zev Sunleaf at CHOP and Isidore Ragusas of Jefferson. I'm going to let them introduce themselves. So Zev, will you go first?
Sure. Hello, everyone. I'm Zev Sunleaf. I'm the Vice President of Tech Transfer, Commercialization, and Research Contracts at CHOP. I've been there a little over 6 years and help our faculty and staff take their discoveries from the bench to the bedside. Hand it over to Isidore.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Isidore Ragusas. I'm the Richard Hefner Professor of Computational Medicine at Thomas Jefferson University. I'm also the founding director of the Computational Medicine Center. I've had a rather unusual trajectory. My bachelor's is in physics, my PhD in computer science, and I've been doing molecular biology basic research for 30 years as soon as I finished my PhD. Before I joined Jefferson, I was with IBM Research for 18 years, and I've been with Jefferson for 13. Thank you.
So what we'd like to do is just start with a brief overview of the patenting commercialization process. And can you pull up the slide? Thank you. So this is a very basic schematic of the process. So it begins usually with a scientist that believes he has a possible invention. And ideally, he contacts the tech transfer office early on to discuss it and to prepare a disclosure of the invention. The tech pursue patent filing or not. They may also decide that they want to do a patentability search before having the application drafted, or sometimes it just goes straight to drafting. They will also
I think we're having a little bit issue on your internet there. Pat, could you hear me? Zev.
Hey, Brian, he's completely frozen up.
Yeah. Zev, would you be able to kind of go through this and give a brief overview?
Sure. So if you look at the slide on there, that really tells you sort of the patent process, starting with our earliest filing, which would be a provisional patent application. That really creates you'll see that calls the priority date. It really gives us a first, foot in the sand to talk about when an invention was created, and it helps us get behind other things in the future. That provisional basically lasts for 12 months. After the 12 months, it's gone. And from there, you have to file either a US application or an international PCT application, which allows you to then file in multiple countries. And after 18 months from that, you have to pick which individual countries you file in, and then start going into the national phase from that. So one of the things you can clearly tell from this is patenting is a long process. It starts what can take years for a patent to issue. And one of the things I actually joke with PIs is someone will say, well, I may not be here 30 months from here, Zevin. I will tell them that's okay, because if an institution files a patent on your behalf, we will hunt you down to send you money if we get it licensed. It doesn't matter if you're here or not. The benefit does accrue to you no matter where you go in the future. So while this may take a long time, just like a lot of science, it's important to start the process early and work with us throughout that. But one of the things I'd like to start talking about is actually what happens before the provisional patent filing. One of the questions we get as a tech transfer office is, when should you reach out to us? And my standard answer is early and often. We are not the NIH, we're not the FDA, we're not a lot of different organizations where you have specific time points you can reach out to us. And if the answer is no, you have to wait 9 months or a year to come back to us. We're your local partner. Whether we're remote or not anymore in this day and age, we work with you on a regular basis. So it's important to reach out to us very early on. You've got an idea and you want to start talking about it, that's great. We can work with you on a plan to get to that first provisional patent filing. But we can also provide you background information on what other competing or collaborative IP or groups there might be that you can work with. So always remember to reach out to your tech transfer office early and often, because that early conversation may give you some competitive intelligence, and they may say, okay, look, this is great. We'd love to see this data. And maybe that data takes you a month, maybe it takes you a year, but let's keep connecting as you get to it. And in many tech transfer offices, they may actually have funding or know of funding to help you get that data. So they can actually partner with you to even get to that starting provisional patent stage. Isidore, what's been your experience on that in working with a tech transfer office?
It's been a very positive one, both with IBM's office as well as Jefferson. I wanted to stress one point that you made earlier about how long things take. I've been at both ends of the spectrum. I think if I remember correctly, my first and second patent application issued about a year after filing. On the other end of the spectrum, we filed an application in 2013 with Jefferson. The first action from the patent office was 8 years later, and it issued 9 years after filing. And of course, the other applications are somewhere in between the two endpoints.
Yes, it is definitely something that takes a lot of patience and a little bit of a thick skin. The patent examiner will first start by telling you that nothing you did was interesting and pull a whole bunch of prior art that you've never heard of and don't think is related. But again, that's why we are here to help you through that process. One other thing I would like to comment on from a timing perspective is when I say early, and a bunch of us as we prepared for this talked about this, is we in tech transfer have all lived through the fictitious Dr. Jones calling you often on a Friday and saying, hey, my grad student Jones is presenting at a national meeting tomorrow. Someone said I should talk to you. Can we, is it too late to file a patent? And all of us in tech transfer have filed those 24-hour patent applications. Pat and I were joking about when we had to do it on paper and actually show up to a post office to get it timestamped before it closed. When we used to do these things in person, I would look at the audience and say, how many of you think you could write a grant application in a day? And everyone would shake their head no. And I'd say, technically, if you had 8 hours, you could write a grant application. It's not going to be your best work. The probability of getting the funding isn't going to be great. And the same is true for us. Think about a patent application as a grant application and a paper with a lot of legalese added on top. So we want you to come to us early so that we have time to work with you to create the best patent application possible, so that when it does start the examination process, it will go through more quickly, and so that we're not keeping people like Pat up late at night trying to get something filed before your grad student speaks the next day or the paper comes out.
And Zeb, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now, Pat.
Yeah, I'm using my iPhone. It's important not to keep me up late, is what I understand. But yeah, I agree with what you've said. It was a common scenario. It's more manageable now with the electronic filing. And yes, it's hard to predict how long something will be in prosecution. I'm looking at something now that was a 5-year prosecution. So there's a lot of unpredictability in this this process. I guess what I'd like to do now is kind of turn it over to Isidore and Zev to discuss, the process of discovery. When should you engage the tech transfer office? What do inventors need to consider? So if you guys want to kind of give some overview on those topics.
So, Isidore, I'll let you go first from sort of the user experience.
Sure. Thank you. The first time you do this, obviously, you don't know how to best do it. It becomes second nature after you do it once. Again, engage with your tech transfer office. They are the best guide for this. In terms of when to approach the tech transfer office, as soon as you suspect that you have something valuable, by all means, that's the time to do it. They can act as a sanity check for you. They can reach out through their different tools they have and find out what's out there already. But if you work in basic research, applied research, clinical research, you pretty much have a good feeling of what the community looks like, what the collective knowledge looks like, and you can gauge fairly well how different your invention or potential invention is, and you can take it from there. It's okay to make a mistake and think highly of something that ends up being not patentable. It's better, in my opinion, it's better to be more optimistic than not, and let the tech transfer office decide what to do.
I agree. And as the inventor, we always assume this area of science far better than we do. I have a lot of people with a lot of different PhDs and master's degrees in a lot of different areas of science in our office, but they will not be as ingrained in the specific science as you are. But the interesting thing is while you may know the scientific literature, companies don't always publish, but they do patent. And I don't know that a lot of research scientists spend a lot of time reading patent applications. Frankly, they're a little dry, and if you don't have to, you wouldn't. So one of the things we can do is we can do that research, and we can bring that to you to show, here's what Pfizer is doing similar to you. So it helps not only the patent process, so we can write a better application, but it's also a little competitive intelligence for your own research, right? We then identify people who you might be competing with, or people you might want to partner with, people who might want to sponsor research because you're working very much in an area that is of interest to them. One other thing I do want to mention is, while we all joked about how long patenting can take, we don't have to wait that time in order to start engaging industry or to talk about licensing. Or if you want to do your own startup to start working with you on a startup, once we file that patent application, we can start marketing it to established companies, or if you want to spin out a company that gives you some limited protection, so we can start those conversations. So things will run in parallel. clinical trials will run in parallel while patent applications are going through prosecution. So don't let that scare you away. But to Isidore's comment, coming to us early and working with us. Again, this is not like NIH or something where you drop off an application and we give you notes at the end and say yes or no. This is an iterative process where we'll read what you sent us and sent us draft manuscripts, data, whatever. We'll start with that, but we will work with you and share with you what we find so that we can create the best patent application and the best marketing plan possible to move it forward.
And if I may add, there is one more valuable dimension that the tech transfer office brings, which is you may have something novel, provably, but it may, if it becomes a patent, it may be difficult to enforce. And the tech transfer office would know that and tell you ahead of time before you engage in this, arguably long process. And I'm sure Zev can give specific examples. I experienced one such case when I was with IBM. They said, yeah, great idea, but if somebody in country X starts implementing it, we don't have the resources to enforce it.
That's absolutely true. So actually, as a tech transfer office, we'll look at a few things. One, is it patentable? Do we actually think we can get patents? Two, to Isidore's comment, can we enforce it? Manufacturing processes, for instance, are very difficult to enforce. We may not know how someone manufactures. Or third, there may not be a market. At my old institution, we had a dental school and someone came up with a better type of metal braces that worked for a very small number of patients. And we looked at them and said, no one wants metal braces, and this is a relatively small indication. It's patentable, but we don't think there's a market. And in academic tech transfer, our goal is not to file patents just to file patents. We really are here to file patents because it helps create the investment incentive for someone to put the money into it to bring it forward to market. So if it's either not patentable, not enforceable, or there's no market for it, that's another conversation we'll have with you, the inventor, to help guide you and let you know why we may or may not go forward. But I think that's a very important point to bring up.
Zev, can you touch on ownership of the IP?
Sure, and no one likes this one. But if you work at an academic institution, a research institute, or a hospital, we are going to own the IP. Not only by policy, but tied to the funding that you're using. So if you're getting an NIH grant, NIH requires us to take ownership of that IP. Now we can give that up if we determine not to go forward with it, but even NIH then has to give us permission to give it to you. We can't give it to you directly. If you're getting sponsored research from a disease foundation, they're going to require us to take ownership so that we can pay for all the patenting and move things forward. Same thing with companies. Now, the benefit of working in academia versus a company, and Isidore, your time in industry, you can probably tell, if you invent something while working for a company, you get a plaque, a pat on the back. In academia, under federal law, we actually are required to share some of the proceeds with you. So if we license something, and it varies by institution, you're generally going to get anywhere from 25 to 60% of any income we generate on that. So even though we take ownership, we're paying to patent it, and my office spends about $3 million a year on patenting things. So it is not cheap. We're going to work with you to do all the licensing, to do all the negotiating, to collect money when companies don't want to pay us, and then we're still going to share a portion of that with you as personal income. And generally, most institutions, a portion of it with your lab to help with your research. So we do take ownership. But in academia, we share those benefits with you while taking on most of the risk.
And can you guys also comment on the concept of a platform technology versus sort of a more individual invention? So for example, the laser came out, oh, what are we going to do with this thing? It's in all kinds of devices nowadays. And that's, if it's a platform technology, there are usually a lot more options as to licensing it. So if you could just touch on that a little bit.
Sure. Isidore, do you have any experience on the platform side?
Only one anecdotal case. I seem to recall hearing that LASIK surgery was invented at IBM. and they didn't know what to do with it because it was in the late 80s. So I believe they sold the patent. Again, my memory is not perfect, but I seem to have heard that.
So I can give two examples, one in my deep history. At my last institution, they invented something that became necessary as part of manufacturing certain pharmaceuticals. At one point, there were 16 drugs on the market that were manufactured using these materials. So we got a little bit of royalty on all of those. It was not invented as a therapy, but as a manufacturing platform. Similarly, for those of us in Philly here, mRNA and the University of Pennsylvania, those patents, if I recall, date back to 2004, those original applications, and on the basis of mRNA technology. I don't believe that anyone had considered COVID vaccines at the time, but that is the basis of COVID vaccines right now. And that platform is used not only for COVID vaccines, but it is being looked at for a multitude of other things. And that is really, to Isidore's early comment about sometimes you don't know what science is going to be useful for. Those patents, when they were filed now 18, 19 years ago, no one had conceived of this. But they were licensed as basic research. They were used by a variety of companies that they found a perfect use for. And now it's got a huge impact, not only on health, but financially, both for, I'm assuming, the inventors and the institution.
So I'd like to move on now. Oh, go ahead.
I just had a question. This example you gave has an excellent timing. You said 19 years, and the typical lifespan of the patent is 20. So what happens, because obviously we'll be using the mRNA vaccine for years to come. So what happens to the original patent? This is something I never understood well, to be honest.
So patents are an interesting thing. Technically, they last 20 years from the priority date, but there's what's called patent term adjustment. So you remember we joked about how long sometimes patenting takes. If the patent office takes too long at certain steps, they should be getting back to you within 90 days and they take 180. At the end, you can petition to get that extra time added back onto the end. So it actually adjusts past that 20 years, but also there's almost no product that starts that has only one patent in it. So your original idea may have been a single patent, but you may continue to optimize and file new things that lead to that product. So while the very earliest patent may expire soon, I'm sure there are other patents that were filed later that will still continue to impact it. And it may be the same inventors, it may be others. But yeah, I do have a personal story. We had a platform technology at my last institution that was licensed by dozens of companies, multiple failed clinical trials. A phase 3 finally was successful and it was approved for market and the patents had just expired. So we had made some money along the way on milestones and things, but no royalties ever came to the institution. It's unfortunate. We're glad that the science got out there, but yeah, that does happen sometimes.
So I'd like to just provide a few comments on applying for patents, and I apologize if I repeat anything Zev said when I was disconnected. But we showed the concept of filing a provisional first, and provisional applications, you don't have to have claims, but I always suggest that you do have, because they provide this. First, it forces you to think, what really have I invented? It also provides a scaffolding on which you draft the application. And hopefully it triggers early discussions on inventorship, which can become contentious at times, especially because you may have other people in your institution that think they are inventors, but also if it's a multi-institution situation, there may be also issues there as well. So I always suggest that when you're putting together the provisional, you do have claims for those reasons. And Isidore, you've done so many filings. Do you have any comments on, like, for example, when you were working with the patent attorneys at IBM or issues that would come up with provisionals?
Everything, maybe an exception, but I must say everything was pretty smooth. Obviously, the first time you show up at the tech transfers office and say, I want to file a provisional, they may ask too many questions because, you need to establish a relationship. After you have proven that you know what a patent is and what it entails, it becomes much easier to ask for a provisional. Personally, as a rule of thumb, my provisionals are not handwritten 2 pages. I try to compile as much information as possible in some structured form, electronically, ideally, a Word document, PowerPoints, things of that sort, and give as much as I can to the tech transfer office with a page of claims. I don't think I ever filed the provisional with handwritten material in it. But again, that's my one data point. I don't know how others handle that.
And Zeb, just, I guess you probably mentioned this, but again, the concept of giving the tech transfer office plenty of time to put together a decent provisional. So it's not one of those, we're at a meeting tomorrow, file a provisional, please. Like, what kind of guidance do you give your inventors on time?
I like to have at least a month, if at all possible. And first, let me step back and say, I don't know of any tech transfer office that if you reach out to them a couple of days beforehand, they're going to tell you you can't present at that meeting or you can't publish that paper. We realize that is your first and top priority, but we do try to educate people to reach out to us early enough so that it doesn't become stressful so that we can get something out. But presentations are one thing, but from a paper perspective, we always want to get something filed before you've got a publication. So I will actually tell PIs that I work with, hey, as you're putting together that very first draft and you're starting to think about your materials and methods and you've got some data, send it to us. It doesn't have to be pretty, but we can take that data and those ideas and we can start our process by doing our prior art and our business analysis so that as you're getting ready, we can be getting ready. Now, we always talk about a public disclosure, that we need to get something filed before there's a public disclosure. And certainly presenting at a meeting with enabling data, which is a whole nother definitional conversation, or publishing a paper is a public disclosure. Submitting a manuscript is not a public disclosure. Most of the time, submitting a grant application is not. But as you're preparing for that, work with us so that we can be doing the patent drafting in parallel to finishing the paper, reviewing the galleys and all those things. But like I said, a month is a really nice thing, but we will work to your schedule if at all possible.
The other topic I wanted to discuss was, you file your provisional, then you have 12 months to convert it. What do you tell your people to be doing in that 12 months? Both Isidore and Zud, what kind of things has your tech transfer advised the inventors be working on in that interval?
I'll let Isidore go first.
Thank you. My practice has been try to generate as much background information and as much ammunition as possible to give the tech transfer office 10 months after the provisional so they can act on it and prepare a proper application.
We just like to have continued conversations. Again, so think about Dr. Jones's grad student is presenting at a meeting and they say, well, and we're planning a paper afterwards. There may be a lot of additional data and thought that happens between those times. So we actually may file a second provisional and combine them two before we convert. So we will talk about if you are continuing to do the research and the work and you're getting additional data or your thoughts are changing about what the invention is, how to deliver it, what it takes. Keep us informed because we want to make sure we get all that data in. And if there are additional, like I said, disclosures being planned of a public nature, presentations, papers, let us see that data because those things can be incorporated into that first provisional or second provisional filed before we have to do the conversion. So again, that sort of ongoing partnership and conversation is important.
And Zeb, can you?
I want to chime in here real quick. We have an audience question from Todd. With the inventions that are coming out of the research labs, how do they notify you of these inventions? Is it like a formal disclosure or just an email saying that we have this? Could you kind of touch on how they disclose it to you?
Yes. So to answer your question, Todd, it's both of those and more. So literally yesterday, I got a long-term inventor who sent a one-page statement saying, this is my new invention and the draft manuscript. We have a portal on the CHOP website where you can submit invention disclosures there, where it asks some basic questions, who was involved, what's your source of funding, and you can attach things. I've been walking around campus, meeting with PIs and say, hey, I just thought of something. Can we sit down and talk about it? And that starts the process. So again, it is anything and everything. At some point, we are going to want to get some things in writing just to make sure we are better understanding you. But sometimes it's a disclosure form, a website, or an email. But again, it's that iterative process where any of those is just the start so that we can work with you to get the best patent application and marketing plan possible. But good question.
And also in that interval, Zev, you're reaching out usually to potential partners. Do you go to them with a provisional, or how do you start that conversation, and what are you looking to do in that 12 months?
It depends. Sometimes the PIs say, we actually don't want you to do anything yet because we want to wait until the next experiments. Sometimes we want to go right away. We can go with the provisional, although in those cases, we will sometimes sign a CDA with the company. But also one of the things I have always loved is timing a marketing plan with a major publication. So, Dr. Jones sends me an invention disclosure, says, hey, we want to publish this paper, Nature, Science, Cell, whatever it is. We get the patent filed, and as soon as the paper comes out, I will send a link of that paper to the company, because that is great data that doesn't require a CDA and can really whet the appetite of the potential partner. The other thing, and I think all of us in tech transfer know this, is the majority of the connections actually start through the PI. Again, the grad student or postdoc is presenting at a national meeting. Companies go to those meetings and they'll see that and they'll say, hey, grad student Smith, have you talked to your tech transfer office? Did you file a patent on this? We're interested in this. And we're hoping that they then connect us with those people. So while we will do some marketing, a lot of our connections will actually come when you publish and when you present, because other companies working in that space will reach out to you to talk about how to partner.
The other thing I wanted to touch on is the concept of using different types of protection. So let's say you see something, you decide it's not something you really want to pursue a patent for. Do you go through a formal process of deciding whether it should be kept as know-how or a trade secret, or maybe file for copyright or some other type of protection? Is there a formal discussion of options when you're evaluating?
We always have the discussion, and there's a big difference between industry and academia in this area, in that trade secrets don't work well in academia because academics want to publish. And again, that is their bread and butter. That's how they get tenure. That's how they get grants. So there are very few things that an academic institution will treat as a trade secret. We will almost never suggest it. Sometimes we will have, again, the fictitious Dr. Jones say, I don't want to publish this. I want to keep it as a trade secret. And we're like, as long as you can do that, but you also don't then want to share it with your grad students and postdocs who want to use it as part of their thesis. So it's a difficult concept. So it is rare that we use trade secrets, but we do often include know-how that's not patentable in a license, because that sort of secret sauce may not be patentable, but it's essential for the company to understand to get the product move forward, which is why one of the other advantages of disclosing patents and licensing is that it often brings sponsored research to the inventor, because the companies realize that not everything can be captured in a patent, and the more of that interaction and know-how they can gather, the more quickly and efficiently they can bring things to market.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, it's funny you mentioned the know-how, because there's sometimes, or secret sauce, there's things involved that you wouldn't otherwise know about unless you're directly working with the inventor, that they do in their lab or habits they have that really make things work much better than just reading a recipe and following it.
Yep. it really does become a partnership. And I do want to say, we have had inventors who say, I'm going to disclose this to you. I don't ever want to work with the company. I see it's important, but I don't want to do it. And we're like, well, we're not going to force you to do that. We can license the patent without you if that's what you want. But the majority of our inventors want to continue that collaboration because, again, it helps them see their invention go to the next step, go beyond what they can do in their lab. And Isidore, you've probably experienced that.
And with regard to, so let's say the patent is issued, it's an important patent. How have you seen infringement identified by your institution? How do you guys spot those dastardly infringers, and what do you normally do procedurally?
That's a politically charged conversation in academia. So I will say, first of all, it's not usually us. It's usually the licensee who spots it because they're keeping a much tighter view on their competition. And we hope that if it's licensed, it's the licensee who's taking on that risk and cost, because patent litigation is extremely expensive.
Yes.
And can take years and not be pleasant at all.
No.
I do know of academic institutions, and I have done it. I've had to sue in my role companies for infringement. There are whole side conversations about what does it make the institution look like? Does it make it look as though we're just after it for the money, right? And they usually don't turn out well and they're very expensive. So for that reason, some institutions don't do it. And it is rare that a patent gets all the way to issue without someone licensing it and that you keep it for that long. So I would say infringement usually is really tied to the licensee. And the funny thing is, and I've experienced this, is you will see the University of A versus the University of B suing for infringement or some other related issue when it's actually Pfizer versus Merck, but they have to go through the patent owners, right? So whether it's infringement or other things, we become part of it, but it's really being driven by the commercial partner because they're the best suited to understand the market side and the value and risk.
Isidore, you were at IBM for quite a while. They're known as some of the largest filers in the world. Did you encounter any infringement cases there? And also, you can enforce the cases in the United States, but oftentimes there's a foreign program, you're going to try and enforce it abroad, which raises other issues like, is there a court system in place to handle this sort of thing? And what kind of remedies are there? So can you comment on some of your experiences there, Isidore?
Sure. I know of one case, actually, it involved one of my issued patents. I was at a scientific venue, and there was a company presenting their product, and things looked awfully familiar to me. So I reached out to the patent office and I said, well, can you look into this a little more? And we got some more information. It was basically they had implemented the patent. And they were selling the product. The problem was the company was based overseas, and it was deemed that it wasn't financially viable to pursue any litigation. So they said, yeah, they are infringing. There isn't much we can do.
Right. Yeah, sometimes it doesn't make sense to sue because even if you have patent protection in that country, the remedy and the cost just don't add up in terms of what you get out of it. I'd like to turn now just to technology transfer in general and discuss kind of the process from licensing to startup formation to partnership. So can you start on that, Zev?
Yeah, so there are a couple of different ways that we can help bring technologies to market. The two biggest are licensing to an established company versus a startup. Licensing to an established company is pretty straightforward, right? We search for companies that are working in this area. We present to them what we've got, and hopefully they find it ties in well with programs they've already got. Startups are a very different animal. Startups, there often has to be a champion who wants to create a startup. It may be Dr. Jones, the inventor, in which case most institutions like ours have a series of services that can help. They can help write business plans. They can help introduce them to VCs, angels, and other funding groups. They can help them find management for a company. But before there can be a license to that startup, the startup actually has to become viable enough to be able to meet the requirements for us to license to them. In other cases, it might be a VC that approaches us and says, hey, we really like that science. We would like to create a startup to license it and take it forward. Under Bayh-Dole, the law that allows institutions to take ownership, the basic tenet is if you have a startup and an established company of equal capability, you should always go with the startup because it was basically an economic development package. It is rare that two of them are equally balanced. And so my board and leadership will often say, well, how do you know when you should work with a startup? And I'll say, the market will actually generally tell us. If no one in an established company wants it because it's either too early, too risky, or too small, a startup is the way to go because it can help de-risk it and get it to the level where then a larger company wants to step in. And in fact, large companies even have their own venture funds to help create those startups. So those are both options. The startups will take more time and more hand-holding, no matter who's creating it. But we do have services and help if the PI wants to create that startup or others to help create that vision and that company. And sometimes we even have funding to invest in those startups as well.
It's almost quarter of. Brian, did you want to open the floor to more questions?
Yeah, definitely. So we can now enter the Q&A session. We do have some questions prepared and also a question from the registration. I'll just go ahead and ask this question, but if you have questions, just feel free to type it in the chat and I'll bring that up. So we have a question from Daniel Kennedy, looks like from BioNexus. His question is, are there ways for multiple institutions to partner on tech transfer or commercialization efforts? And if you need any clarification, feel free to chime in, Daniel.
So the answer is yes. So actually, it happens very often because we get a lot of disclosures that come into us where Dr. Jones from CHOP worked with Dr. Smith from Penn or some other place. And so the two institutions actually co-own the IP. So we do work together, and that's because the scientists started working together. So that happens at every institution. At CHOP, it happens a lot because of our relationship with Penn. We have a lot of our IP that's co-owned between the two institutions. I've been doing this for 20 years. I've had situations where there are 5 different universities who all have inventors on that patent. So we work together to figure out who's going to take care of the patenting and the licensing. I also had a deal a couple of years ago where the patents were not co-owned, but there were multiple patents filed in the same area of research. It was actually macular degeneration at the time. So I worked with 5 other institutions on 3 different patent portfolios to bring them together to help license to a startup. Literally herding cats. And it took a lot of work, but it was beneficial because that way those there weren't people competing, they were working together to bring something forward, and it was more efficient. So it happens sometimes because it's required by co-ownership, other times because it makes sense from a technology standpoint.
Isidore, do you have anything to chime in on that? Have you worked with other institutions on certain inventions?
We have several collaborations currently at Jefferson, and when I was with IBM, we had collaborations with other organizations, and the wording of the collaboration agreement stated the terms of joint invention ownership. We haven't gotten to the point where we have an invention to speak of, so I cannot comment on the stages beyond that point, but it's probably a good point to remind scientists it's a good practice to have a collaboration agreement in place before you start working with Dr. Jones or Dr. Smith that Zev mentioned at a different institution.
Thank you for that, Isidore. Question from Alex. when approaching a company or potential licensee, who within the organization are you typically making first contact with? And Zev, I'll pass that to you.
It varies. As I mentioned before, sometimes the contact starts scientist to scientist and then flows up to us. So the head of a scientific group at a pharma company may reach out to our Dr. Jones, see if there's some mutual interest. That person will introduce their head of business development to our tech transfer office. If we're doing it directly, it's usually the title is business development. Sometimes they have what's called a technology scout, larger companies. So it is people of different titles, but it's whoever we think on that side is in charge of finding new ideas to bring in. But it's usually, the titles are usually technology scout, business development, strategic alliance person. So that's if we're doing it. But again, we find it can be most powerful scientist to scientist. So if our Dr. Jones meets Dr. Smith from Pfizer at a conference and they realize how well their technologies work, Reese's peanut butter cups, for those of you old enough, your peanut butter got in my chocolate, how well that would work together. And then it comes up to us to figure out how to create a legal and contractual partnership to work together.
Okay, thank you. Another question from Daniel, and this is regarding forming startups. What type of contract terms / agreements work best to exit a technology for startup development from the university? Is it a lease, outright purchase, or etc.?
So universities never do purchases. They don't sell technologies. It's generally a license of some sort. For startups, it generally starts off with an option to license, but an option that gives you some time to finish your fundraising and put your team together. But it will be a license of some sort that says, we give you rights under this patent to move forward in exchange for equity, royalties, milestones, as something of that nature. But I will tell you that whether it's a startup or an established company, the financial terms are usually not the biggest issue. It will be the diligence terms. And diligence terms are always a little bit more difficult for startups because they don't have the resources. So your tech transfer office will want to work closely with you to make sure we put some terms in to guarantee that you are moving the technology forward. And we don't want to do this because we want to pull it back or be mean or nasty, but we want to make sure, again, that the technology, whether it's with a large pharmaceutical company or a startup, is getting the care and feeding it needs to move it forward towards helping, in our case, children.
Okay. Great. Next question. So let's see. Over the past few years, NIH has been putting a lot of efforts into creating opportunities, funding opportunities for translating research into the marketplace. So what are some opportunities available for academic researchers that they can take advantage of? And are there any changes in strategies that you're aware of involved in these shifts from the NIH?
Some of the other folks in BioSP could talk about, there's a new REACH grant that's being applied for, which gives tech transfer offices more resources to work together to create hubs, to provide funding, advice, mentorship to help move technologies and startups forward. As an individual PI, there are different grants devoted specifically to commercialization. If you are interested in a startup, there are SBIR, STTR grants that can help provide non-dilutive funding for moving the technology forward. Different institutions, so at CHOP, we have GAP funding, which can provide funding to the PI to do research in the lab to move it towards commercialization. We also have investment funding, which can invest in startups that are spinning out. And that's true. A lot of institutions have those types of funding. So it is incumbent on you to sort of look and see what NIH might have, but also to talk to your grants office and your tech transfer office to see if they know of specific programs that match well with your targeted science. There are some things that are very general, but often we'll say, hey, we know of an RFP specifically for traumatic brain injury that we can help you apply for. So, there are a lot of different resources out there that we can help you identify.
What about you, Isidore? From the researcher perspective, have you noticed any changes at the institutions that could help you translate your technology?
There is an increasing demand for biomarkers, especially for neurological disorders. That for several years that was not on the radar screen of NIH or other funding agents. I see some that have appeared in recent months.
Pat, do you have any insights on why that is? Why there's such a big focus on biomarkers now and as versus earlier?
It's everyone's always looking for drug targets, and what's happened now is with some of the advances in sequencing and looking at large genomes, there's ways to identify things that may not have been present in the past. But I think we're going to see more and more of this, especially because with the computer technology available and the sequencing, it's really become of interest to companies to look at genomes and think about targeting. So I think that's the technology has kind of pushed it forward because we have these new powerful techniques. That's what I've seen.
Okay, thank you. So this question for Isidore. What should an academic researcher be prepared for when their work leaves their lab and moves into the commercial sphere? So what are you preparing on your side, and how do you work in parallel with the tech transfer office?
That's a difficult question. I haven't been that fortunate yet. So we certainly have several patents. There is interest. I guess the one thing one needs to be prepared of is the same thing you experience when your child goes to college, right? It's it's equally impactful. I'm saying that half jokingly. Many of the things we work on that may end up in a patent are things that we've spent a decade or two working on, and eventually we see the light at the end of the tunnel. And you speak to Zev or people in my tech transfer and say, great, you get to the point of a patent, and then you have to let it go. So it's I can see why it would be difficult. So of course, a child going to college is even more impactful, but you get the idea.
Okay, thank you. Zev, how about you? Do you have any insights to add to that?
I think the college analogy is great. At some point, you have to realize that you give up a little bit of control, and that the company is going to take it the best way that they know how to get it to market. Now, what we don't ever want to see is that they just stop working on it and they don't let it go forward. And that's, again, why we put diligence in. But it does vary from technology to technology. As I think I mentioned earlier, sometimes the company will continue to work with the PI for years to help it move forward. In some cases, that only goes up to a certain point, and either the PI doesn't want to work on it or the company doesn't need the PI. But you still continue to watch it sort of like your child growing up with admiration and love, but you realize that they start to make their own decisions and the company starts to make its own decisions. And you just hope that it's a good legacy for you in the future. But it is something you do when you license, you do start to give up some control over that aspect. Now, it is important to realize that with all tech transfer, when we license, you don't have to give up working in that area. We retain the right for you to continue doing your research and continue innovating in that area. But the company may be the one in charge of how they commercialize it. So you might be giving up some control in that area while you continue working on it from an academic standpoint.
Okay, thank you so much. So we have about 5 minutes left. Just want to leave this time for Pat and the panelists to kind of leave you with some departing wisdom. Pat, do you want to start off start us off with what
Yeah, I
you
think
think?
I think the most important thing is that you contact the tech transfer office early if you think you have something. Start the process as soon as you can. I've never seen a tech transfer office get irritated by even a theoretical Dr. Jones, as Zev has been discussing. It's just the sooner you speak with them, the sooner they can discuss whether they want to pursue it and manage it, so that's not a mad, keystone cop dash at the end. So
I will echo that. And again, I work in a medical institution, and one of the things I try to equate it to is we all go to see a doctor and we start out by having to fill out a bunch of forms about family history. When did we first notice this pain? Tech transfer offices are like that. We will ask you a lot of questions, and we don't do that to be annoying. We do that so that we can best learn what this idea is, whether we have responsibilities to other based on funding, who was involved, and how it's different. So we will ask a lot of questions because we just really want to dive deep into understanding it so that we get all this right. So that if you start early, we could have those questions. It's not the keystone cops, everything being thrown at one time, but we have a chance to, put together a really good patent application and use that as a really good jumping off point for who to reach out to partner on, whether it's sponsored research, licensing, startup formation.
And I would say, do not underestimate the value of your work. If it's something you've been working on for decades, if you really know if you have something valuable. If in doubt, reach out to the tech transfer office. I mean, they are there to help answer these questions and guide you toward the future. So I don't think you have a better partner than the transfer office. So.
Okay. So we have 2 minutes left. That just for the fun of it, do you have like a worst case scenario or a bad story that bad example of what not to do?
I do, actually. At my last institution, we had a PI who actually got federal funding to take something all the way into phase 2 clinical trials, but had never disclosed to us early enough so we could get nothing. There was nothing we could patent. He had disclosed everything. And even though from a science and technology standpoint, he could move it forward, no company was interested because they had no way to protect their investment. Yeah. So it was really the eye of the storm negativity. He was very put off by it that no one would license it. And we said, patents give companies the ability to have a 20-year monopoly where they can charge exorbitant fees before things become generic. But if they don't have that ability, they're not going to invest what could be millions or hundreds of millions of dollars into it. So because he had not contacted us early, we couldn't get anything to patent and no company would step in. And so he got it to a certain point and it just couldn't go any further.
Okay, thank you for that story.
Yeah.
I just want to take this time to thank everybody for joining in. It's been a great discussion, I think. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to any of the speakers here. And if you want their contact information, my contact information is right here. Reach out to me and I will forward you the information. All right. Thank you, everybody, and have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.